Please won't you love thy neighborhood?
I forgot 2 weeks in a row to wear like a cardigan, and I was going to take my shoes off and switch them out like Mr. Rogers. And you notice the big kids as they were just leaving there, even though Mr. Rogers is changed to Daniel Tiger now. I don't know if you all know this or not, but there's a cartoon now that kind of plays off of the friendly neighborhood type thing. Uh, those kids were still interested in figuring out what that was. I guarantee you they don't even know who Mr. Rogers is, but that was kind of fun to see. We're in our series Love Your Neighbor or Neighborhood. Last week, Vince and David shared their testimony of their relationship and what that grew into and the impact of that relationship and the impact of eternity that has for Vince and for Vince's family and just for David's understanding of who he is and what God's called him to be and called all of us to be and how capable we all are of just building relationships with one another. This week we're talking about making time for the hood, for our neighborhood, for those people that are in our area of our life, whether it may be work or our actual next door neighbor or maybe family we see a lot, those people that are in our life a lot that we can speak truth and love into. You all know the show Andy Griffith, right? Surely most of us do. I saw reruns. I remember watching them a lot. I don't know if it was Dad's favorite show, but I remember watching a lot after like the 9 o'clock news on Fox. They did the early news, so I would remember staying up and watching that 30 minutes a lot of nights with Dad, and I'm sure Adam and Matt as well, and I'm sure Mom was busy cleaning up after us. But I remember that, and obviously we had Barney, the deputy that was always doing something funny and always getting worked up over something. And then like that cast, the rest of the cast that I don't think much of. I think of those two guys, but the rest of the cast they were really like a close-knit family, like a neighborhood. They knew each other and they knew all the drama and what happened across the street and stuff like that. But Griffith said this about the show afterwards. He said, though we never said it, and though it was shot in the 1960s, it had the feeling of 1930s. And he goes on to say, the time that's gone by, a time that's gone by. And everything about life in Mayberry, especially if we remember the story of what that looked like and got the image in our head, it's a far cry away from where we're at in the 21st century, isn't it? So different. Obviously, technology and some of those things and some of the clothes we wear and stuff like that, but just how we relate to one another is so different now, isn't it? Well, we're more on our phones and connected to our phones. If I'd left school or home today to come here and I left my phone at home, I probably would have turned around and came and got it. Even though I was with everybody, and everybody knows where I'm going to be at this morning, I probably would have had to go back home and get it. Like, that's how dependent we are on our communication device and how much, unfortunately, sometimes that takes place of face-to-face communication and that value there. We're continuing this series, Love Your Neighbor. Jesus has these words in the greatest commandment. I want us to look again at that this morning. It's Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Jesus makes it very clear there, right? And we talked last week about what's most important. Loving God and loving your neighbors. And so last week we talked a little bit about how we could be intentional about just living that out. What if we just lived that out in our life? What would that look like for our community if just the 50, 60, 70 of us here lived that out genuinely and intentionally every day? What if we took that and said, we're going to love our neighbor, whether our neighbor's a half an acre over, the next lot over, or 10 acres away. We're going to love that neighbor because that's our neighbor. We're going to love our neighbors that we work with. We're going to love our family that we see all the time. Unfortunately, we talked last week about this. A lot of times we go, instead of loving, to coexisting with our family or with our co-workers or our so-called neighbors in life. And we just kind of get by and we tolerate each other. And there might not be that genuine love. And as I reflect last week and into this week, I've kind of had an eye-opening of how much I do that in my job at school. I just coexist with so many teachers that I could easily show God's unconditional love to. And I fall short of that. We handed out these neighborhood maps last week, and if you want to grab one on your way out, I'll leave them here on the table. But I think we got a picture so you can see it a little bit better. But these maps where we had 8 people we could list. And if I said this afterwards to somebody, just being up here, making eye contact with you all and saying, let's fill this in with 8 people that don't know Christ, that they're in our life, how kind of wide open our eyes got. And to me, it kind of caught me off guard a little bit because we do such a good job of loving people. But how well do we know the people we love? Are we really getting to know their facts and the story of their life so that we can eventually share our story of what God's doing in our life? Now, I kind of, last week, if you remember, I said, don't freak out with the 8 because you all were like, oh my gosh, I have to put 8 people down. And I said, we're going to narrow it to 5. What if we just took 5 people in our life that didn't know Christ, weren't connected to a church, and whether they came to our church ever or not, we know we're not about just filling Revive up, right? By connecting people to a body of believers somewhere throughout the world. What if we just prayed for them? We intentionally prayed for them and looked for opportunities to intentionally love them and to build a relationship with them so that as time goes by, we can share the story of what God's done in and through us. What if we did that? Now, here's kind of where we left off. How do we do that? What does that look like? That can kind of be overwhelming. Paul talks about this in Colossians. So I want us to read just a verse out of Colossians. It's Colossians 4:5. It says this. It says, be wise in the way act toward, try this again. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Now, outsiders kind of sounds a little harsh in today's, like they're not a part of us. We got the inside scoop. They're the outcast almost is kind of how we see outsiders. But they don't have this. Paul's writing to those who don't know Christ. Those are outside of that relationship with Christ, outside of the kingdom right now. It says, be wise in the way you act toward them. Be wise in how you relate to other people. And he also challenges us to make the most of every opportunity we have. Now, I would guess to say we've all, including myself, even though I'm preaching on it 2 weeks in a row and again next week, that, we've passed up opportunities this week where we could have been intentional about loving people in our life, and we passed that up. We could have been intentional about maybe developing a relationship and investing in a relationship this week that we've kind of passed up. But sometimes I don't think we recognize we have where we live and who's in our path. We have this opportunity in life every day that God's given us that we should take advantage of. What if it's not a coincidence that you're living where you are right now? Now, it's a funny question for some of you that know me right now because the conversation I have a lot is about this 30 acres in Hancock County that I really want to buy, right? But what if God's not ready for us to move yet? What if God's got you right next door to somebody in your life, whether it's next door where you live, next door in your office, or maybe in your family? What if that's intentional? They're in your life intentionally for you to develop that relationship. What if maybe you've not gotten the job change that you were hoping to get or you're kind of pursuing? Because God's not ready for it. He's ready for you to be where you're at and wants to use you where you're at. Saying, let's love God and let's love others is really easy to say and simple. And I think that's simple because it's hard to live out. It's simple for us to do because it is just so hard to live out consistently. So today, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about 3 key ways that can help us make the most of every opportunity God gives us. 3 key ways that can help us take care of the apathy that's in our life about the people that are in our life. 3 key ways that maybe we can be more intentional about what we're doing with our life instead of just maybe coexisting with people that are in our path. The first one I want to talk about this morning is just be willing. Be willing. You know, I realize that not all of us are like me. Some of us are maybe more shy, and we kind of shy away from extending ourselves out to other people for various reasons. It's not wrong. It's just different than the way I'm wired. So it can be really easy to just say, you know what, I don't want to reach out. I don't want to connect. It's so uncomfortable for me. I'd rather be by myself in my house with a book or with TV on or whatever the case may be. We may find ourselves pulling into our garage, shutting the garage door, avoiding interactions with our neighbors unintentionally, but it's just more comfortable for us. Or we may find ourselves not walking to the break room where everybody's at during the day because we'd rather have those few moments by ourselves. That's part of it. I get that. I do that myself. This week, there were 2 days this week when I'm like, I just don't want to go to lunch with everybody else. And I went out to my car one day and sat there in my car. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying I was right or wrong in that. But I get that feeling of sometimes we just want to be by ourselves. And Jesus went by himself several times. So it's not a bad thing. But there is a balance. And God's called us to connect and relate to other people. So I do get that. But I know what it's like to avoid spending that relational energy sometimes that you feel like it takes to build that relationship. But if we're going to be people who make the most of every opportunity, we have to be willing. We have to be willing to have those opportunities and take care of those opportunities. I think out of anything I shared this morning, outside the scriptures, this is what I want you to hear. In life, we can do a few things really well. You can't do it all really well. You can pick a few things and do it really well, okay? I think it's a good idea that we make sure that one of those things we do well is what Jesus called us to and what he said was the most important, which is love God, love your neighbors. And if your life, the way it's set up, you're having a hard time with loving God and loving your neighbors, then maybe life needs to change so that you can do that. But we could go out and spread ourselves so thin and run around chasing so many different things in life that we forget that this is the most important thing. Love God and love your neighbors. Second thing, I think it's important that we be interruptible. One of the reasons we don't build relationships with our neighbors is that we think, I don't have time. I'm so busy. I've got my checklist to do, right? We've got so many things. We got places we got to get to, things we know we got to get done, deadlines we've got to meet. And so whether it's at work or home or wherever you find yourself at throughout the week, you allow your time to dictate if you're going to love intentionally or not. Guilty myself. Let's be honest. Mayberry, that's a different pace of life, isn't it, than where we're at today. So our pace of life actually makes it harder to be intentional about just making time to be in relationship with one another. Whether it's with us here or those who don't know Christ, life is busy, and we can easily fill it up with so many different things. On that note, I think it's kind of fascinating that we all have the time-saving devices in the world greater than anything ever before, okay? I put microwave on here, but this morning I was thinking we have something even better than a microwave. What is it? Instapot, right? Microwave, we can go and get some things done. I'm super comfortable with using that microwave to get things heated up and ready to roll. But we can get a whole meal prepared, while we're gone. The Instapot's running, and we can go. We can be ready in 30 minutes and have all of it ready. We have text messages and all kinds of other ways to contact one another, right? Instantly, tons faster. We have DVRs, so we don't have to lock down in front of the TV to watch our favorite show on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock, right? We can DVR it and watch it whenever we want to. Much more convenient. And yet, with all the time all the things we have to save time, there's still not enough time to get everything done. And maybe it's just my stage in my life, being where I'm at with little kids and things, but I feel like I have less time now more than ever. And that's probably mostly because of my kids, but I also have the most access to time-saving devices and things that are going to help me cut my time down on things than ever before. It takes me less than an hour to mow my yard when I decide I'm going to actually mow it, right? We have so many other things. They used to take me way longer because I had a push mower. But we allow so many things to get in the way from our life being interrupted. Jesus lived an interrupted life. Well, I want us to look at it in Mark. It's just an account of, just an example of how Jesus lived interrupted life, where he allowed the needs of the people around him to interrupt his life. So let's look at that. It's in Mark chapter 5. Let's go do 22 through 24. Is that on there? Okay. Let's try that one first. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus, that's what we're going to go with, okay? I said it confidently. Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him. My daughter is dying. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. Now I want to stop right there. That's super important, right? We've got a little girl that's dying and a dad pleading for Jesus to do something about it. So as Jesus pushes through the crowd, obviously he's kind of in high demand right now. He's doing a lot of healings. As he pushes through the crowd to make his way to this daughter, a woman reaches out and touches Jesus' clothing in this story. Okay, and we're going to read here in just a second some more on 27 and 28. But she wasn't somebody that was just enamored by the famous Jesus and what she was doing. She was reaching out in hope because she was in pain. So 27 and 28 says this. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Now, this lady's been sick a long, long time. Reaching out to Jesus was that act of desperation, that act of faith where she was hoping that would take care of her pain and suffering that she had had for so many years. And Jesus immediately stops in the story. He immediately stops and says, who touched me? Okay. Now, I just read that they're pushing through a crowd. Okay. Disciples are, probably doing a little crowd control to help him get to this little daughter that's dying. And somebody touches him. Now, I'm sure he'd been touched several times reaching out and people bumping him and stuff like that. But he notices one touch different. He has a recognition that, hold up, even though there are other people pulling me in different directions and I'm headed towards this little girl, I got to stop because something needs to happen here. So he says, who touched me? And the disciples were like, Jesus, who knows who touched you? There are a lot of people around us. No telling who touched you. But Jesus does something remarkable. When someone reached out, he stopped and noticed her. He didn't just rush on to the next thing on his schedule, even though healing a daughter, saving a daughter would have been a pretty important thing. He stopped. He noticed. He never let the urgency of the moment keep him from seeing and loving the people in need. Now, I don't know about you, but I allow my busy life and my schedule in my life and the things I think are important dictate when I stop and take time for people, instead of allowing Jesus to tell me when I need to stop and take time for people and allow those interruptions. Jesus stopped. So think about this. What might our neighbors need from us? Whether it's your literal neighbor or somebody in your life. Rather, what might they need from Jesus through you? We need to be interruptible. That might mean staying outside for 5 or 10 more minutes at your house, talking with a neighbor when you know you got a list of things you're hoping to get done before the evening. That might mean dropping what you're doing at work and having a conversation with somebody, even though you've got a list of things you're hoping to get done before you leave work. That might mean stopping on a Saturday morning when you're trying to mow the yard and going to play with the neighborhood kids. If we're really going to love our neighbors, we have to let our lives be interrupted. The last thing, so we've got be willing, be interruptible, and be ready. Sometimes it's hard to reach out to our neighbors because we don't feel like we know what to say or what to do or even how to start that conversation. And if you've had somebody in your life that you've not really invested in and they've just been in your life but you've not built a relationship with them, it is going to be different. It's going to be weird to have those conversations. But I think it's important to be ready to develop that relationship. In sports, there's this kind of saying that goes that it's kind of trendy that everybody likes to say. It says, next man up. So if somebody gets hurt, that next person that's supposed to fill that position needs to step up and do the job, whatever that role is. Which is, I like that, but it is kind of trendy. But it's kind of the same thing for us in our life, where we are called to be ready. And whether you feel like in sports you're a starter, if you're coming off the bench, coach isn't going to give you half a game to try to figure it out, right? If you're coming off the bench, you got a couple minutes to come into the game and do your role, or maybe one at bat, or one batter to face to pitch to, or one situation that you're going in for. And the coach and your team's expecting you to be ready. They're not saying, well, let's keep them in there and give them 6 more tries coming off the bench. No, they're called to be ready. In the same sense, when God gives us an opportunity, when he calls us and says, Kevin, this is a moment to take advantage of, we're called to be ready to say yes. And if we're not ready, we're going to have every excuse under the sun of why that's not our job that we should do. To be ready means that we need to be ready, be prepared to say yes, knowing that I'm saying yes when God calls me to. I'm not deciding if I'm going to say yes when he calls me to allow my life to be interrupted and to love somebody and to build a relationship with them. I'm going to be ready. I'm saying yes to it. No matter how awkward or how uncomfortable I feel with it, I'm called to do that, and I'm going to be ready. Mike and Lacey have had a kind of a experience in their life where they had an opportunity to kind of be ready, and I'm sure they didn't feel ready, but they took advantage of this opportunity, and they have a pretty powerful testimony of that. Mike's going to come up and share that with us this morning, kind of like we did last week, and just talk a little bit about this story and what that is. So Mike's going to speed on up here, zoom up, and talk about that. Mike and Lacey bought a house several years ago, right? 4 or 5 years ago, maybe? 4 years ago in Lewisport. And they've been renting a home in Hawesville, and they bought this house in Lewisport. And they actually have a next-door neighbor that they were able to kind of take advantage of an opportunity to really develop a relationship with them. So, Mike, you just want to talk real quick about like that situation, how that kind of came about, and your first initial connections with them?
Yeah, so it was about 3 years ago. I think they moved in. We'd been living at the house for about a year, and the house was kind of sitting vacant. And there was 4 young boys and mom and dad, and mom and dad had a history with drug dependence, so it was a little bit of a tough situation for them, and you could tell that going in too.
Right off the bat, you
Yeah.
can kind of see that.
Yeah. So
So what about like how'd that relationship start? Like obviously, that I'm sure that kind of creates a barrier when I'm assuming.
yeah.
I've never heard you say that you and Lacey are drug dependent.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different world
so
there.
we didn't particularly have a great relationship or have a relationship with the parents at the beginning, but the boys we did. When you have 4 boys, they're outside playing all the time.
Yeah.
So they'd be outside playing football. They'd be riding bikes. They'd be doing everything. So obviously, if it's summertime, I was outside too. So we would I'd go out there and just throw a football with them, or talk to them when they're outside playing, and then it morphed into at the end, there for a while. Back before I had the boot on, we would have some like legendary races every single night. We have a long straight stretch of a street, so every night when it'd get about 8 o'clock or so and it'd get a little bit not so hot, all of us would get on line and we would run sprints down the road all the time. And some of them would be on roller skates, some of them would be on a skateboard or bicycle, or some of them would just run with me. A lot of times if I was exercising, that's what we did. So they'd come out of their house and we'd just run. We'd just run all the time and have all these races and throwing football, and we'd have a good old time. And it was pretty neat. So that's how we developed a big relationship there. And then when mom and dad came outside, we developed more of a relationship with them too.
So like the kids basically
Yeah.
pulled that opportunity to kind of connect with them, and later the parents.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure, like most of us, I'm sure you weren't thinking, oh, here's a perfect opportunity to like seize it with God. Like it would probably just kind of happen, kind of natural.
Yeah, and especially as there's a lot more turmoil in their family. Dad, for the 2 or 3 years that they lived next to us, did his best to hold a steady job, but he worked nights. And then at one point, mom, kind of ran off with the drug dependence thing and literally ran off and took the vehicle and everything with him. So it really made it tough for their whole family. And so a lot of times if dad's working nights, then the 8th grader is, watching the 3 little boys or whatever. So they didn't have anybody at home during the night. So a lot of times we'd have them come over and we'd help them with homework and things like that. Or Lacey would help them with a lot of the elementary homework, because that elementary math is really hard for me. I would help them maybe with some middle school homework or anything like that, and we'd eat a meal every now and then. And then obviously I was like, all right, just prompting the Holy Spirit and just like, let's take it a little deeper. We would pray before we eat, and then maybe we have an opportunity to talk about Jesus a little bit. And that little step to make it uncomfortable for me and make maybe uncomfortable for them opens a door for God to do work. And there would be times where they'd knock on our door late at night, like we were in bed late, and tell us what was going on. And a couple times they asked us to pray for them. And I thought that was big, for them, that they had enough faith to like, what, we want them and we want to pray together. So we would pray together as a family. And I even went over inside their house a few times to do that, because the boys had a lot going on in their life. And so we had the relationship first, and then you could kind of bring Jesus into it after that.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a lot of opportunities here. It just started with little kids wanting to play. Sounds like they were desperate for just somebody to give them attention and just help them just be kids, And I think a lot of situations, in a family situation that is full of turmoil and tension, and they're right next to us, I think it's all our tendency to just kind of like shut our door and hide and stay out of the way. And just a little bit of a relationship with the kids led into these opportunities for them to goof off together, so that when they could come to the table, they could pray together. And then that when they felt like they weren't safe, they felt comfortable waking up a family next door and asking them to pray. Like, that didn't just happen right off the bat, right? That happened with Michael getting out in the street and racing in the evening instead of exercising. He allowed his life, and Lacey too, allowed their life to be interruptible. Obviously, when you're wanting to sleep, that's very interruptible, right? So tell me a little bit about like the rest of that story. Obviously, things didn't go well. They would kind of come over there. What?
Yeah, so mom kind of left the whole picture, and then so they moved away about a year ago or so, and they were living over, I think, in Tell City, and Dad was working nights, and he was walking home from work one night. I think he got sick, and he was hit by a car, and he was killed. And this was back in the spring. So that was really, really tough on us and tough on them, I could imagine. And so they're living with they're relatives in another county now, another school system. I think it's a better situation. Seems like their life's improving, a little more stable, a little more consistent. And that's, kind of with what David and Vince were talking about, how the relationship is. Like this one, I don't know where it's going to end. You don't maybe exactly see the fruit of your labor now, but who knows in the future? I'm not sure, about Dad and Mom and that, but hopefully the boys have at least some bit of a foundation in Christ, and a little bit of faith to hopefully grow from.
Yeah.
So
Mike didn't share this yet, but I'm going to they picked them up and would take them to Backyard Bible Club. Well, over here when we were doing our Backyard Bible Clubs for 2 summers.
Yeah.
The opportunities they had to pray together over meals and when things weren't going well. That's the seeds that are being planted right there. He didn't share a whole lot about it, but I remember Mike coming to me some and just kind of asking for input, like, hey, I don't know what to do here. And I'm like, I don't know either, but we can talk about it and just kind of work through some of that and support one another. And he had opportunities to kind of speak truth into this dad some. And that I'm sure that never would have happened. Dad never would have approached him if Lacey and Michael hadn't developed that relationship with those kids. And now more than ever, those boys need those prayers, right? They needed those prayers then. They needed our Backyard Bible Club. Even though we could easily be disappointed in how things go or what we expected it to be and it looking different, they needed that. And we don't know what their story is going to look like down the road. But Michael and Lacey, just like all of us, just like last week, just took an opportunity with somebody that was in the path of their life and let a relationship develop. And it actually started with the kids in the family, which is often the easiest to do, right? Develop that with the kids. Kids are more open to letting people in their life like that. And then moving towards that. And this tragedy here could have a beautiful story to come out of it. And we don't know if they're going to come back to Michael and Lacey and continue to develop a relationship as they get older and remembering that or not. But I can promise you this. They're going to remember the stories and the experience and the safety they felt with a family that loved God. And they're going to know that no matter what happens, they can go to God in prayer. And if Michael and Lacey didn't, what that story could look so different. We talked last week about David and Vince. If David just allowed that relationship to kind of just stay with Vince as kind of just work-oriented, and Vince maybe wasn't ready to pursue that. He was kind of sharing that. David pursued that. Mike and Lacey pursued that. And those stories have changed just because we were allowing God to use us in a relationship, right? There wasn't no big gospel sharing, come to Jesus moment where we had the words. It was God doing the work, not us.
And speaking on that, it's not to glorify me or Lace or anything like that. I mean, there's been a million opportunities I've had to love my neighbor and to share the gospel and to love on other people, and I've just said no, or I failed, or I was too busy and things like that. This is just one instance where I was like, okay, literally they were right next door. So if I had a chance, and maybe said no one day, I had multiple opportunities, and they were easy to love, you know what I mean? So those boys, it was easy to be around those boys all the time. So it was just one of those opportunities where, you could do this consistently and help them out.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. We can do this. It doesn't have to be rocket science. God wants to use us. He doesn't want us to have to be this biggest marketing scheme convincer of the gospel. He just wants us to love people and be there for people and build a relationship where you can say, well, because you're going to have an opportunity to say, here's what God's doing in my life. I've messed up so many times, but here's what I know about God because here's what he's done in my life. And that's where we're called to be. There's not a coincidence that God says, love me and love your neighbors. The transformation that can happen in your life and the people in that are around you in life and in our community can go exponentially as we continue to invest. These boys are going to another county, and I promise you, God's going to use this experience to remind them what they're called to down their path, down their road. Vince kind of shared a little bit last week about how, hey, I didn't really know Dave was being intentional, but as we've come along with that, we've had conversations about how intentional he was, and now I know that I can be intentional about this. And so David's continuing to be intentional in his life, and now Vince isn't intentional. And so now we have more people being intentional about loving people and just being good neighbors, loving our neighbors and the people that are in our path. It's not rocket science. It's being willing. Are you willing? Are you willing to let your life be interruptible if it's a knock on the door at 11 o'clock at night when you were asleep and you got to go to work the next morning and you've got to take the kids now to school? Is your life that interruptible? And being ready. If you decide you're going to wait to say yes to it when it comes your way, it's going to be so easy to say no to it when it happens. Are you ready to say yes now and commit to God that, God, when you give me these opportunities, I want to say yes every chance I get, every chance. I know it's going to be awkward. God, help me make those intentional yeses in my life. Here's what I want us to do as we close out with the last song here. Take time this week to find one way, one intentional activity that might give you an opportunity to connect to someone, to build a relationship. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. It doesn't have to be rocket science. Last night, I finished mowing the yard. My kids were getting ready to go to bed. Kendra was taking care of the bath times for them. And I walked out to get something in my truck, and I saw my neighbor working in his yard. So I made the excuse to walk across the street and get my mail. I've talked to this neighbor before, but I had a 10-minute conversation with him about what's going on in life and projects we have around the house, and just develop that relationship a little more with this guy I already know. It don't have to be in rocket science or some genius plan, but find one way this week to just be intentional about loving on somebody that doesn't know Christ this way, just in a way that's going to develop that relationship down the road. Let's stand, let's sing. If you have somebody as we sing you want to pray for in your life, we have this box that we've talked about. If you want to pray for somebody in that box or somebody you put on your list, I'd be more than glad to pray with you over here. Or if you just want to come up here and pray, that's fine as well.